because it's 1:00, and the last couple times we've started at 1 and we've literally ended at 1:31. So we got to improve by 1 minute this time, finish on time.
Everybody's busy.
Welcome everybody to another awesome Tech Talk Tuesday. This is the episode 17. And if this is your first time, and there might be a couple of you, because I know we had some new registrations last week, you can find all the previous recorded shows on YouTube. Dan puts it on YouTube about 48 hours later. And if you haven't looked at the YouTube channel and you got nothing else to do, you can go watch Tech Talk Tuesday videos or forward them to a client, a customer, all of that. So they're all on YouTube. Today's topic is going to be turf management. And I'm going to do a quick introductions before we get started. We've got Chris Wright, our VP of Sales.
Good day.
We've got Dan Conger, our training manager. And our special guest today, due to the topic we're going to do, this is Ed Hodnett, who has a background in golf, turf grass management, et cetera, before joining the HydroPoint organization and Baseline as an RSM. So Dan's going to take us. I wanted to make a quick note because we're going to be talking about turf grass management. We're going to be talking about how to use our tools. And I want to remind everyone that what Baseline makes are tools, and what you hear today will be sort of how to use the tools. But I like to kind of remind people that there's no right or wrong way to manage turf. There's just different ways. So you might agree with what we say. You also might disagree. And that's okay, because we're not here to be the expert in turf grass management. We're here to kind of tell you how our tools work, open your horizons, and get you to think about some things. So with that, Dan, why don't you kick us off?
Awesome. Yeah. So turf management is the reason we're kind of focusing on turf management is in the correlation between irrigation management. If most people are going to manage manage the irrigation to their turf, because it's going to show the stress the most, right? They have the shallowest root system out of everything, and they're going to be a great indicator, a canary in the coal mine, if you will. You can miss a couple of irrigation cycles with some deep rooted trees. You do that on a shallow rooted turf system, and it's going to scream at you. Or when we talk about coverage, irrigation coverage in DU, right? Turf is where we're going to look at it most. We're not it's nearly as big a deal for plant material. So we kind of realized with Ed's background that we could really dig into this topic on this one. So I'd like Ed to give us a little bit about his background before he came over to work with HydroPoint and Baseline. So primarily, you've been in the golf industry, Ed?
Yeah, so I come at this a little bit differently. And one of the things I'll chime on with what Andy said is we say in my industry that there's a lot of different ways to farm. So I went to Texas A&M. I've got a degree in agronomy, turf management, and then I spent 30 plus years working in the golf industry, both as a superintendent and then later in life as an agronomist working with one of the somewhat prominent design firms, which took me frankly all over the world trying to figure out how to grow grass on mountaintops in China or deserts in Morocco and everywhere in between. It's given me sort of a different view on how to use central management tools like we offer with Baseline. And I think there's some things that, will make total sense to the people listening as we go through it.
Right. Yeah, because I come at this from the landscape side, and I think that's probably the way some of our background, and this is the other side, and it's a slightly different world, and you have different pressures and different performance goals, but the commonality here is turf, and that's what we're going to we're going to keep coming back to that. Say how does that translate into someone managing a high school football field? How does that come into someone managing a park or managing a residential turf grass?
And so from my background, my goal was always to make the turf areas, they were typically going to be high performance, meaning they were going to have a lot of traffic. They're going to have a lot of stresses. Many of the ports of call that I had as a golf course superintendent or a landscape manager were in areas that had high ETs, very, very arid, very poor quality soils, poor quality irrigation water. And yet using our toolbox, we were able to deliver very, resilient and survivable turf grass, playing surfaces and landscape areas. And one of the things is kind of how you treat the landscape differently at different times of the year. And for me, particularly for turf, let's say coming out of winter, I want to wake up my landscapes a certain way. And so from the fertilizers or some of the other plant protectants I might utilize to how I irrigate, the irrigation is very specific throughout the different seasons of the year to try and essentially cultivate an endurance athlete. If you had a marathon runner, you couldn't feed him, sugar pops 3 meals a day and sucking down Coca-Cola and expect him to perform. You would want to put them through sequential stresses to be able to make them more adaptable and able to endure the races they're going to run. It's similar to turf grass.
Yeah, I think you make an interesting point there that you intentionally want to create stress because that will enhance the performance of the turf long term, right? And there's a strong correlation between the irrigation management and the turf management itself, right? Being mindful of that and applying technology in a prescriptive way will help to promote that.
Hey, Ed, quick question as it relates to, waking up the turf as you sort of described it. Is there how would you know when it's the first day to start watering again? And that might not have worked in the Southwest, but say somewhere where it's seasonal. When is the first day to water?
When it's Tuesday at 9 p.m.
Tuesday at 9 p.m. is not a good time to water anything, Chris. Haven't you learned?
To me, it really it's focused on whatever species that you're growing. But if you're in the warm season areas where we're dealing with Bermuda grasses, if they're not overseeded, meaning they haven't been, overseeded with winter ryegrass for color or playing conditions, there's no need to really, you want to keep an eye on the soil moisture over the winter. If you're in extreme drought, you probably need to supplement. But for most of us, we didn't put a lot of irrigation down until we knew the soil temperatures were getting around 60. And at 60 degrees is when you're going to see warm season grasses pop. So
to answer Chris's question very specifically and to reiterate it, soil temperature is hitting 60 degrees Fahrenheit is when it's going to start waking up for warm season grasses. Not Correct. Air temperature, but soil temperature.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Yep. And I had a different perception of that when we were talking earlier about which is going to be colder and which is going to be warmer. Is the soil temperature generally going to be warmer than air temperature or generally colder than air temperature?
Soil temperature is generally warmer.
Yeah, I would. My brain had it flipped the other way, but I see that. But really,
it depends too, because it can get hot in the midday for 2 hours. The soil's not warming up, and then it cools back off again. So it's probably like an average daily temperature. That's a better number to look at than what it was for an hour.
That's a good point, Andy. And yes, there is a buffering capacity of the soil, and that is also changed by soil texture and the moisture content.
So in golf, how were you getting your soil temperatures?
So soil temperatures, a lot of that early on was just manually sticking temperature probes in the ground. In fact, on putting surfaces, a quick aside, during the frost season, we would station ourselves at the edge of the practice green with a thermometer in the ground to try and show the golfers why we couldn't let them out yet, just as an education tool. With our baseline toolbox, however, and this ties into that beautiful paddle that you're waving around, not only does it tell us soil moisture, and that can be at differing levels in the soil profile, but also soil temperature. And so there's a lot that can be derived from that sensor input that I describe as better information is for better decision making as a landscape manager.
Yeah. Then you may be using that data just as a reference, not so much as operationally, but Absolutely. Just having that real-time data available to you can make a big difference in how you may manage that turf.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Absolutely.
Especially if you're a park district and you have 30 sites, that's just like going around to 30 sites and sticking the thermometer in. It would take you half a day or longer.
Right. That is a big difference, right, between landscaping or landscapers or landscape maintenance contractors on a golf course. You've got one site in a golf, and you know every little nook and cranny of that, and that's not necessarily the case for landscape management.
No question. In the sensors, and again, it feeds back into, I think all would agree when it comes to soil sensors, more is better. It's great to have as many as would be appropriate on a site or that can be afforded, but you can tell a lot about the differential of your soil types, the solar exposure, et cetera, just from the temperatures and moisture content you'd see from our sensors at different points in a landscape. And on a, let's say a ball field, there's a lot we can do with that soil moisture and temperature to tell us how we want to manage that to get ready for the play season.
So I want to dive a little deeper into temperature. So we talk about using it for waking up and knowing when your plant material is going to be growing, maybe when it's time to start really irrigating in earnest. But what are some other things that you could use soil temperature for managing turf?
Well, you could argue that there are different ways that you could start to chart when, the soil temperatures are at a certain level when you'd want to normally put out your pre-emergent herbicides or some other treatments could be tied to that. I can't give you a specific range because we weren't that advanced when I actually maintained turf for a living. But there's definitely things that you could start charting. And again, better information for better decision making is what I'd key on. But again, sports turf, there'd be ways that just from moisture content, get away from temperature a little bit. But if we want consistent playing conditions on a ball field, football, soccer, baseball, having those sensors in different locations where you could see that differential moisture, and you're going to set your own set points. When this sensor's reading X, that's where I've seen it when it's in the best condition. So that's going to be our target. Very common in golf tournaments today for each green to have a grid pattern drawn up, and every 10 feet, let's say, they take a soil moisture reading. And by targeting how they apply moisture, they can get a more consistent playing surface edge to edge.
Yes, and keyword too there, Ed, not only consistent playing conditions, but also consistent reading. So when you got a device in the ground and it never moves because it's permanently installed, you have very consistent reading over time to work with.
Well stated.
Yeah. Yep. So let's clarify that. So you're saying that moisture content impacts, of course, plant health, but it also impacts how the game is played, how golf is played.
Absolutely. Or think about it in sports turf. If you want firm, fast infield for baseball, you'd want to have an idea of that set point and be able to say, okay, when we're ready for this tournament this weekend, softball tournament or an important baseball match, we want that infield to be really firm because we want the balls to make it out.
Right.
I've even heard of coaches that use that for strategy.
Yeah,
that's a
I've heard that too.
And
that depending on the sport and in soccer, for instance, home field advantage. A lot of that is how wet they keep the turf during play,
right?
To dictate the ball speed during passing, right? And the home team is the one that specifies that for play time so that they could have some kind of advantage because that's how they practice.
That is pretty slick. When I first heard that, I was blown away by that they could tweak it in their favor. Well, it could even be as simple though as if the moisture content is this, you're going to have less damage after a game or better recovery. That's a possibility too. Not necessarily playability, but it's recovery. Well, that's horticultural, but essentially what you're talking is not really horticultural, but it is part of what a turf manager might be tasked with.
Yeah. So if we take a step back and we again go back to that analogy, we want the landscapes to be resilient, to be able to take the stresses. So for most of us in the warm season, the smile states at least, and really I'd say that's universal nationwide. In the spring months is when the plants are at their best adaptation to be able to, tolerate the stresses, tolerate that. So during that period is where I want to really focus on deep and infrequent watering, to
Perfect.
water the soil profile as fully as it can possibly be saturated, and then let it drain down. And doing that during the most the time of year where the temperatures are conducive for the plants to, not be overly stressed, they will sequentially start putting down deeper roots and therefore have that much more to draw on when they get into the real stress periods.
That's a great point, Ed, because when the plants are stressed, you have to water them differently than when what you're talking about now. When the plant is not stressed, you can water it really deep, get those roots going. But when it's stressed, you water differently.
Exactly correct. And that's where you'd go into summer months. And at that time of year, it's just hang on. We're not trying to grow roots. We're not trying to really make the turf any tougher. We just want it to survive. And so, again, the deep and infrequent mantra is still applicable, but conditions are going to
when it's stressed, you might not be able to do it. You might not be able to go infrequent because you're not watering to the roots anymore. You're watering to whatever is being stressed.
You are spot on, Andy. And so it might be you're watering every day, and a lot of people do in the hot periods. And then as you go beyond that, depending on what part of the country you're in, you're going to be looking at things like moving into your overseeding regime, if that's what you're doing on your landscape, which means we've got to, late summer start drying it down and getting the Bermuda grass or the warm season grasses slowed up so we can try and get up our crop of cool season grass. And it's really dual cropping. I mean, you're growing two separate crops with two separate management regimes twice a year. But again, tying back into our toolbox, having the soil moisture where you're hitting your target moisture range when you're ready to do your prep for overseed, making sure that during your overseed that you've got adequate moisture there for the seeds to germinate and take hold with the highest establishment rate. All of those things are in favor of a tool or toolbox like we offer with Baseline.
For that deep and infrequent watering, you're preaching to the choir as far as the programming, and the programming would be using our lower limit water strategy to allow the moisture to dry out a bit to a particular moisture content level before it is allowed to water back up.
And then Dan, additionally, that dry lower threshold adjustable. So in the spring, we've seen that it can be a lot lower of a lower threshold because it's not under stress, like I just mentioned. But in the summer, you may have to raise that threshold so that your frequency, comes together and you're watering more often.
Right. Yeah. Nice.
And that ties in somewhat into my thinking about, the number of programs that are available, specifically on the 3200. We've got 99 programs that can be used. Well, most of us as landscape managers on a regular basis aren't using anywhere near that capability. But for me, if I'm in the shoes of a professional landscape manager, I'm going to use a subset of those programs for the different seasons. So I would have Ed's springtime, regime, and I would have however many, programs needed for my landscape that is under that regime with those settings. And then I would have my summer regime or my overseed regime. And to enact or activate, all I've got to do is enable or disable that program going season to season to season. And with just a few keystrokes, move into my different management thinking.
Yep. Yeah. And Craig Stockhouse just dropped a question or a comment into the chat that I think is brilliant. Yes. How much does mowing height affect watering strategy in turf? And on a golf course where you could have up to 3 different mowing heights for fairway, apron, and rough, right? So how do you adjust for that in making sure that you're providing the plant water requirement as well as providing the playability required?
Absolutely, and it's a balancing act at best. And we also have different construction and different methods to enhance that survivability. The longer that you can leave turf grass within reason the more survivable it's going to be. Turf grasses did evolve by being chewed and mown frequently, but each turf grass has its own mowing height that it is the most comfortable at and will root the deepest. The tighter you mow those surfaces, and again, it depends on the plant species significantly, you're putting sequentially more stress. So generally speaking, the lower you're mowing, the shallower your roots are going to be. Now, with regard to, prescription athletic turfs, football fields that have a sand-based root zone with under drainage, or what we would use on putting greens and some tees, we have built a physical environment where the grass can now, if properly managed, put down deeper roots, even though they're being cropped very, very closely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the nursery business, I know we often, referred to different plant material, and the top growth was a reflection of the root growth. Yep. Right. And so very much the same for turf grass. I think you make a great point. Everybody loves to have a nice, tightly mowed turf grass surface, but realize that if you're doing that, the roots are going to reflect the up or the top growth of the plant, and it's going to be more difficult to manage.
Absolutely.
Keep the aesthetics there.
And there, that kind of ties back into our sensor, tools, because then you can start really tracking that and really see where your point of diminishing returns are. And we know, gosh, we can't go below that or we really suffer.
Yeah. Yep. Very cool. All right. So another question has come in. A lot of our technology goes on as a retrofit to existing systems as an upgrade. And so when using conventional wire instead of 2-wire, when you've got a sensor that is connected to a conventionally wired controller, what are some of the important things to keep in mind with that?
Well, number one that I think of is wire integrity. Just because there's a wire there doesn't mean we can communicate across the wire.
True.
So what we see a lot of to install a sensor, you go to the controller and the controller cannot find the sensor. And the wire's good because the solenoid pings on and off, but you can't find the sensor, right? So when that happens, people typically think, I got a bad sensor. There's something wrong.
Yeah.
And it's a good reminder that there's a difference between voltage on the wire path versus communication on the wire path. Two different things altogether.
So let's say we've got a conventionally wired system. We know we've got a good wire, and we've got a sensor connected to that wire, and the controller's not seeing the sensor. What's wrong?
So actually, forgot. You could have the polarity mixed up. That's usually like a quick one, a gimme.
Okay. What else? Come on, Cogger.
A1, A2, baby.
That's right. You got to make sure that the sensor is wired to the valve wire, and that valve wire lands on the terminal board at post A1 or A2 or B1 and B2. Right. So specific posts in the controller are designated as sensor posts on a conventionally wired board. So it knows where to go out and find that sensor reading.
Because it won't check all the others. It only checks those two, which isn't really a big deal because you would want to do a representative zone. This sensor represents the others. You don't need, nor do you want one on every single zone.
And that would tie into something that I would say, Dan, too, is that sensor placement. If we're tying into a conventionally wired sprinkler or valve, we do want to make sure that we're putting that sensor where it is in a representative area, not too close to a head, particularly if they're valving head, because we don't want to flood it out and get false readings.
Right. Absolutely. Right.
So since we're on the subject, and since it is Tech Talk Tuesday, and we're here to provide good technical information for users, if you're standing to the controller and it's a conventionally wired controller, and you notice that it'll go click, 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 click every few minutes, right? That's the controller going to those R boards to take sensor readings. And if you look at the board during that process, you'll notice that post A1 and A2 and B1 and B2, if it's a 24 station conventionally wired controller, those posts will have LEDs above them, and they'll blink on during that process, right? And if the sensor is connected to the wire that's connected to that post, that LED light above that post will stay illuminated, confirming that there is a sensor that is seen on that wire.
Right.
Okay. So there's your technical food for thought today.
Yep. And we do see it's pretty common, or it can be on old systems. Solenoids work fine, but you have to check one or more additional splices in the system. It oftentimes is a wire, because that's the one that is cut usually multiple times and spliced together. And all it can take is, 2 or 3 really crappy splices to block that communication signal.
Yeah. Right. Or to degrade it. Yep.
Chris, before we run out of time, there's a great observation here in the chat box too, that talked about putting the sensors in the infield clay.
Yep.
So on baseball and softball, to be able to manage that well, because that's where the game's played. It'll also, if you're working in a school district setting, or even in a park setting where you've got little league coaches, if you can ensure that it's not going to be too sloppy or dusty dry, you can also, avoid some of the public relations issues, I'll say, with the coaching.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yep. You show up on field and the infield is seemingly super dry and it's dusty. Not only can you reference the soil moisture sensor, but you can initiate a quick wet down of that infield with the coach's button, right? Take advantage of another program on that controller to facilitate that.
Nice.
Very cool. Great input today. This is good information. So we're already at the bottom of our half hour.
Yeah.
Unbelievably. So time flies when you got good knowledge, right? So what do we have on tap for next week, Mr. Conger?
We're going to talk about drought management. We here in the West, we're going to have another dry year. It's just about the time they say the drought's over, it comes back. So we're going to talk about drought management and how we can help out with managing your landscape and your irrigation.
Absolutely. And also we'll address some of the costs associated with water and how you can manage your water sources so that you avoid tiered rates that may be in effect or get increased because of the drought conditions. So should be good information, and looking forward to that. So Ed, thank you so much for joining us today. That was fantastic, feedback and knowledge. You're a great guest. We may invite you back another time.
And remember, he did say more is better. More sensors are better. I love that, Ed.
Right.
I am still a sales guy. So,
So again, we encourage all of you to share with a colleague or a coworker the link to Baseline's Tech Talk Tuesday. We want to increase our listenership and are always on a mission to do so. So please help us to facilitate that and share the link and bring more people into our audience. And if, again, you want to get more content, you can go to Baseline's YouTube channel, which is Baseline Web Training, all one word. And you've got a full catalog of all of the Tech Talk Tuesdays that have occurred before, recorded, and you can watch them at your leisure. So appreciate you participating. Thanks for coming out, taking the time. Go out, work hard, be safe, and join us again next week for some more great information on Baseline's Tech Talk Tuesday.
Yep, thanks for joining us, guys. Appreciate it.
All right.
good job.
See you later. Bye-bye.